Before Muhammad, before Jesus, before even Buddha, there was the Greek storyteller Aesop, who has had the singular literary success of having his stories repeated, especially to children, for 25 centuries. People of my generation, I hope everyone, knows the story about the boy who cried wolf. Aesop tells us about a young man whose job it was to go out during the day and watch over the village's herd of sheep. It's a singularly boring job, though, and in this story, to create some excitement, the boy cried out that there was a wolf. So the villagers all came running to his aid, and when they didn't see a wolf, they, of course, scolded him. But day after day, the boredom set in again, and the boy tried it once more. And time after time, the villagers learned that the boy was just bored and that there was not a wolf, and so they stopped responding. Then, of course, one day, a wolf actually came in out of the forest and killed a lot of the herd. But no one responded to the boy's cries for help. Hyperbolic exaggeration, those things can be very useful tools to public speakers. I'm not sure you could write a sermon without at least some of it, but it loses its effect the more you use it. We will say that Julia Roberts has a smile that's a mile wide, but we don't really mean that. I have personally many times announced that I was hungry enough to eat a horse, but that wasn't technically true. Although, in the Middle East, I have eaten more camel than I want to think about. But the best thing about hyperbole is when it is used sparingly. In this, what is, by my count, the 15th presidential election of my memory, I am aware that politicians have been crying wolf way too often. Of course, when people in the 1800 election between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson trumpeted that it was the most important election of a lifetime, they weren't even then reserving such hyperbole for presidential elections. 100 years ago, a Tennessee newspaper, the Greenville Democrat-Sun, described their coming vote as being the most important election in the history of the country, when Greene County will be called upon to vote $200,000 for the purpose of resurfacing roads. So I'm not sure how to go about recovering the language of imperative after it's been so abused for hundreds of years. But folks, we are 6 months away from a presidential election that could in very fact be the last free and open democratic election in the United States. Our nation is in such grave peril, it is incomprehensible to me that it even needs to be said. But by the numbers of people who are still supporting right-wing candidates, evidently it very much needs to be said. In previous years, I can remember having considered myself to be a fairly astute political observer, but I have to confess that right now, I don't even understand the country that I'm living in. I have always been a political liberal, for which I will give direct credit to my childhood in Christian Sunday school. Clearly, I was hearing something that my peers in rural Kentucky did not. The Bible I grew up reading was decisively anti-war. It taught compassion to extreme degrees of radical compassion, of showing charity towards the poor and the sick, telling us to welcome immigrants, to oppose racism, to be sexually circumspect, and to always tell the truth. Inexplicably, I grew up in the same part of the world with the same religious indoctrination as Mitch McConnell and Rand Paul received, with remarkably different outcomes. So naturally, I thought that the election contest between Ronald Reagan and Jimmy Carter would be the most important of my lifetime. Then later, I thought the contest between the war criminal, George W. Bush, and the war protester, John Kerry, was the most important. I didn't think that the 2016 election between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump was all that important because I was fairly confident that you'd have a hard time finding a dozen people in any state who would even consider being tricked into voting for Donald Trump. I and a whole lot of other people were wrong about that one. I watched the election returns that year from Belize, where I was scuba diving with my daughter. We had both voted before we left the country, but that day when Trump was elected, my Asian daughter cried, and for the first time in her life, she referenced her race. She said, "I don't want to be brown in Trump's America." We were stunned. We were shocked. But I consoled my daughter, saying that Trump would probably only be in office for a month or so, that he was such an obvious con man, a sexual predator, a liar, and a criminal, that he would have to be impeached almost immediately. I was wrong about a lot of things in politics that year, and I have felt like a stranger in America ever since. I even said to many friends in 2020 that I was so relieved that now that Trump was voted out of office, we could safely turn on the national news and never ever hear his name mentioned again. Trump made me ashamed to be an American. And at that time, I was doing a lot of traveling. I was speaking around Great Britain frequently, and there was no shortage of people that I met along my lecture tours who were willing to remind me of why I should be ashamed to be an American. But when Biden took office, I felt like there would never be a reason to have to mention Trump again unless something came up in the news about him being shivved in whatever prison he was serving in following the insurrection. My apologies to any of you who used to think that I was smart. I clearly do not have my finger on the pulse of the American voter. But I have speculated several times over the past 7 or 8 years as to why voters allowed themselves to be seduced into voting for a philandering, uneducated, dishonest con man, because Trump's affirmation of racism, of misogyny, of xenophobia validates the dark shadow, the id that lies in many of us. But earlier this month, Jeffrey Goldberg published an article in The Atlantic that looked at the cowardice demonstrated by many Republican political leaders, elected officials, many who have first-rate educations and years of experience in public service, who just seem to have allowed their character, their judgment, their morals to just collapse at the feet of a tyrant. There were 43 Republican senators who had to run for their lives on January 6th of 2021. They came back to the desecrated Capitol building late that night to finish their work of confirming Joe Biden's election amid the millions of dollars of damage and even feces spread across statues and art. And many of those 43 Republicans stood up and railed at Donald Trump's election lies, his refusal to do what every other American president has done, which is to demonstrate the strength of American democracy in a peaceful transfer of power. Instead of a peaceful transfer of power, Trump called upon supporters from across the country to come and help him to stop the steal by storming the Capitol, beating down doors and beating armed police who had been ordered not to shoot the rioters, even though most were calling for civil war against America. Had this insurrection happened a couple of generations ago, I personally believe that hundreds, if not thousands, of these rioters would have been shot. I believe that Trump and many members of his family and administration would have been quickly put on trial for treason, and they would have been executed. Now, one protester was shot before she could break into the room where elected officials were hiding. Eventually, order was restored, and many protesters were arrested and tried for their crimes. But the Republican leaders who so forcefully denounced Trump on the evening of January 6th, by the time it came to vote on impeachment, which in my opinion was a very mild and humane response to a national tragedy that we all watched unfolding before our own eyes on TV, and which these senators saw in person from their hiding places, all 43 voted against impeachment in what has to be the most colossal display of cowardice and hypocrisy in American history. The voting public may have a very short memory, but educated and experienced members of the legislature knew that what they experienced was treason. It was insurrection, an attack on our Constitution and the free democracy that Constitution creates. And they did it out of fear and out of lust for power. They pretended that what they had seen with their own eyes, experienced and heard, was not as bad as they knew good and darn well that it was. The rioters erected a hangman's noose on the Capitol grounds to hang Vice President Mike Pence. But if these events had taken place a couple of decades ago, surely it would have been Trump and his minions who would have been hanged. There may be some voters who are so deceived by conspiracy theories and the MAGA QAnon cult that they can't see it. But you know that short of a couple of rather challenged Republicans on the Hill, you know that they all know that what they witnessed was insurrection. Mitch McConnell, Josh Hawley, Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, Rick Scott, most of the others, they know that they turned their backs on America. They turned their backs on the concept of democracy in order to hold on to power. None of them deserve to hold elected office, or in my opinion, they shouldn't hold a driver's license. They should not be free to roam about after what they did. The lust for power has remarkably extended to a kind of misogyny that I have to confess, I just don't even understand it. We've debated the abortion issue for years, but sadly, to most people, it seemed like a tempest in a teapot. No one but radical Catholics and fundamentalists really wanted to take away the constitutionally protected right of a woman to do that most basic thing, which is to manage her own person, her own body, her own reproductive life. But that tiny minority was loud and persistent. Republican president after Republican president had promised to appoint judges who would overturn Roe v. Wade, but they never meant it. They never did it. But Trump did it. And he didn't really care about the issue. One can only wonder how many abortions that Donald Trump has paid for through the years to avoid having to pay child support from births from his many affairs. But he appointed judges who were willing to do the unthinkable. And in a fit of undiluted hypocrisy, the longest-sitting justice, Clarence Thomas, not only voted to overturn Roe, but in his comments on the decision, he said that the court should also take up previous decisions that legalized same-sex marriage and even legalize conception. How is that fact not being discussed in the media every day? That members of the Supreme Court want to regulate the lives of women right down to the point of deciding about whether they're going to use contraception. Thomas, who was revealed to have tried to start an office affair with Anita Hill by telling her lurid stories about the nasty porn videos that he watched, now wants to legislate moral Catholic standards into law so that all of us who are not Catholic have to abide by the teachings of a church, teachings of which he blatantly ignored in his own life when he was younger. We have all heard the pushback against the pro-life movement, pointing out that if they were really pro-life, that they would favor free child care, universal health care, that they would want to outlaw the kinds of guns so commonly used to kill children while they are in school. And folks, come on, this is not an argument. For there to be an argument, there has to be two plausible sides to the issue. There is no argument in defense for being anti-abortion while also opposing social support and protection for children after they are born. This is not an argument. This is just religious and political hypocrisy. And we need to call it that and stop acting like there are two sides to this issue. There is not. I've never said much about Thomas Jefferson's often repeated quote about how erecting a wall between the church and the state is essential to maintain a free society. In fact, I probably have been guilty of thinking that this concern was rather outdated. Churches can freely advocate for causes, either for women's rights or in opposition to women's rights, in favor of gay rights or against gay rights. But churches don't get to write legislation. But Clarence Thomas, in a curiously hypocritical religious passion, actually does want to write Catholic values into law. Why would anyone care if gay people are allowed to marry one another? If you don't believe in gay marriage, then don't marry someone of the same sex. Why would anyone want to prevent a woman from having access to contraception? Well, the why is not a happy story. The why is as old as religion's desire to control women and to keep them down and out of power, to control women's reproduction, control their sex lives, and to make sure that straight marriage was the only legal option, none of which is any of their business. And it should shock, horrify, and motivate all of us to realize that this is, in fact, the most important election of our lifetime. And for reasons that make absolutely no sense at all, it is an election that very well may go the wrong way. Why would anyone who is not a billionaire vote for Trump's economic policies? Why would anyone who isn't a right-wing lunatic fundamentalist vote for Trump's misogynistic policies? Why would anyone re-elect any one of the 43 Republican senators who failed to impeach Trump in 2021? Why would anyone who loves democracy vote for anyone who has clearly demonstrated in their holding up aid to Ukraine that they actually support the reestablishment of the Soviet Union under Vladimir Putin? I cannot believe that this is America. And I can tell you, people in Europe can't believe that this is America. The only two people in Asia and Europe who are happy about Trump's popularity are China's President Xi Jinping and Russian President Vladimir Putin, both of whom are despots who have refused to leave office when their constitutional term in office was over. And both are tyrants that Trump envies, because he tried to not leave office and failed, and surely if given the chance again, he will try again. Putin wants to take the Ukraine, and you know that he will not stop there. Xi Jinping wants to take Taiwan, and you have to know that he will not stop there. Everything that spiritually people value is in danger as voters in the world's last great superpower and economic engine go back into the ballot box where a possible majority just very well may embrace disaster. No one should sit this one out. No one should downplay the importance of this November's election, and no one should vote to take away rights from women, from minorities, from immigrants, or any of the rest of us who are clinging to hope for a sane world.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.